Hello, my name is Ed Malthouse. I am a professor at Northwestern University. I'm in the Integrated Marketing Communications Department and the Engineering School, and I'm also the research director for the Spiegel Research Center. It's my great privilege to be giving this keynote to you today, and I only wish that we could be together in Zagreb enjoying all the wonderful Croatian food and wine and hospitality. For about the past 18 years, the focus of my research has been on engagement. What I'd like to do in this talk is to give you a survey of how I see the engagement field, so how we've gotten to where we are, but more importantly, where is customer engagement research going? And so by the end of this talk, I hope to give you a lot of ideas on how you could take your own research and put it into the engagement framework. The way I want to do this is to start with a paper that I worked on called the Customer Engagement Ecosystem. This was a conceptual article where we came up with a new framework for understanding engagement. Now, since then, I've been involved with many other research projects that are somewhat related to engagement, and I'd like to make some connections between those and that engagement research today. Customer engagement has been a very important topic within business and marketing for at least the past 15 years. On this chart, I'm showing a Google Trends search for the term engagement. And so what you'll see is that certainly 15 years ago, we had an interest in the subject that has only been growing. I've also done a search on Google Scholar for the term customer engagement. What comes back on Google Scholar is about 38,000 articles. So this is clearly a very important field. We've seen countless articles in the trade press attesting to its importance. There have been many special issues in our top journals in the field. And so it's become a fairly mature topic within marketing and services research. I'd like to give you a slightly different perspective on this topic. I'm in a department of marketing communications where our focus is on promotion and advertising and communication. And I think that gives me a slightly different perspective than a lot of the other scholars in this area who tend to come from a services background. Likewise, my background as an engineer and big data scholar also gives me a unique perspective. I think it's really interesting to see what engagement is not. And so what engagement is not is AIDA. And so AIDA is this model that was proposed in the late 1890s. Attention, interest, desire, and action. It's kind of a standard for advertising textbooks. This is the way we thought about marketing communication prior to engagement. And what's important to notice about this is it's all marketer controlled. So the marketer is going to lead the customer through various steps to ultimately purchase and become an advocate for the brand. It's one-way outbound communication. Where is the role of the customer in here? Well, the customer is just supposed to be doing various things along the way. So there's no co-creation. I pulled a definition of advertising from one of the main textbooks. Defines it as paid, non-personal communication from an identified sponsor using mass media to persuade or influence an audience. Notice we're using paid media. We are not trying to help the consumer in any way. We're trying to persuade or influence them, and it's non-personal. That's where the world was 20 odd years ago. What happened next? Actually, what happened started prior to 2000. It's what I've characterized as a digital environment. A digital environment is one where you have computer mediation. Perhaps the most important of all digital environments was the introduction of the internet and the browsers that happened in the early 1990s. But that's not the only one. So social media, mobile devices, smartphones, now the Internet of Things, are these environments where everything is taking place in a computer mediated environment. So why is this important? The first thing that this does is it allows for consumers to create and distribute their own brand messages to a global audience. Okay, so that's the first reason that these digital environments were very important. Prior to that, if I didn't like a product, I could complain to my neighbor. Now I could complain to the entire world. The second thing that digital environments enabled was for platform owners to create massive databases of consumer behavior information. If you had a retailing website in the 90s, you could record every click that your customers were making on that website, which is a very different world compared to the traditional retailing environment where you don't really know what your customers were looking at. This is really what is creating big data. It's these digital environments where every customer action gets recorded in a big database. The reason this is important is that it has enabled many new types of contact points that are better targeted and more personalized. So instead of having these mass ads that the definition of advertising described, it became much easier to be able to personalize things and not show them to everybody. Another thing that happened because of these digital environments was compressed time frame for making marketing decisions. The internet wasn't the first time that we had one-to-one contacts. For decades, companies were sending out direct mail and telemarketing. But the time frame for making decisions with a direct mail piece was over days or weeks, whereas as soon as things became digital, the time frame where we had to make a decision, should I target this person or not? What message should I show this person? Became a millisecond. And so as a consequence, this attracted a lot of people from computer science to work on these marketing communication issues. Let me give you a kind of a short history of some of what I've just been talking about. In 2001, I remember reading about this "Yours is a Very Bad Hotel." And so what happened was two people, they showed up at 2 o'clock in the morning at the Houston Doubletree Hotel, and their rooms had been given away despite the fact that they'd had a guaranteed reservation and were premier members of their loyalty club. And so what did the people who were turned away do? Well, they created a PowerPoint presentation and circulated it among all of their friends. And what happened was it went viral. And so all of a sudden, this PowerPoint presentation describing the service failure was global and being covered by many news outlets. And I remember thinking how different this was. This was a user-generated message that had gone viral and had been enabled by the digital environments. So this was one of the first instances of where the power of the consumer really showed. And what happened after that, companies started trying to use these digital environments in very different ways. And so I think another landmark case of this was the Dove campaign for Real Beauty. Starting back in 2004, Dove started experimenting where they were using digital environments to encourage participation. So one of the first iterations of this campaign for Real Beauty was to get consumers to vote on these real women. And by real women, I mean not a supermodel, but these are normal women. And so is this woman gray or gorgeous? And so very different sort of tactic at the time, beyond just broadcasting mass advertising messages designed to persuade. In fact, Dove stated that their goal was to provoke a discussion about what is the meaning of beauty. So it wasn't just supermodels, it was the beauty of normal women like we see here. Another extremely famous iteration of this campaign happened in 2005, where they posted on billboards in train stations around the country to kind of further this discussion. What happened was kind of unexpected. They got a 16-minute slot on the Katie Couric show, as well as parodies from late night hosts. The point I'm trying to make with this is this was a very different form of marketing from what we had using the purchase funnel and AIDA. And so this is really what prompted me and my co-author when we were writing the pinball paper. The Dove case was very much on our mind. The pinball idea was, this is not bowling. Traditional advertising is bowling, where I create brand messages, which is like the bowling ball, and I throw that out and hit my customers with that. What's happening with Dove and many others was akin to pinball, where the marketer releases a ball into an unpredictable environment. This was launching a pinball into a very unpredictable environment where late night TV hosts and other stakeholders diverted the ball and accelerated it and took it in directions that Dove really couldn't anticipate. There were additional developments. One of the key topics that also came out of this was ad avoidance. So these same environments that allowed marketers to have very precise targeting and personalization also created all sorts of ad blocking tools. So at the time it was spam filters and DVRs. Now we see it in the form of ad blockers. The point with this was the advertising in the way it used to happen was not going to work anymore, because consumers could block out those messages. So I think this was captured very well. An article by John Dayton, where they were just emphasizing that consumers now had the power to block out ad messages, and brands had to be invited into their lives. Very different way to think about marketing. The concept of engagement has been notoriously difficult to define. What exactly does it mean to be engaged with a brand? There have been literally dozens of definitions offered over the past 15 years or so, and many of them are very much at odds with each other. Perhaps the most controversial issue in defining engagement is whether it's a psychological thing or a behavioral thing. Okay, so does engagement live in the consumer's mind, or is engagement an action? On the psychological side, a lot of people define engagement in terms of the customer's motivational state. Early Holobeek definitions were around, what are my motivations for being with this brand? So if I can understand why a customer is motivated to buy my brand, that why I'm motivated is my engagement. I really also like the work of Torrey Higgins and others, and he describes it as a state of being involved and occupied. So if I'm engaged with something, I'm occupied with it, I'm fully absorbed with it. Now, I'll just point out the difference between the behavioralists. So a behavioralist would say spending time with a brand is engagement, but that's not the same thing as being absorbed with it. I could spend time watching a video, not because I'm really into it, but because I have nothing else to do, as opposed to being fully absorbed and drawn into that video. This state of absorption is really a psychological thing. So Bobby Calder and I started working on this way back around 2002, particularly in the area of media, but we later expanded our work on media engagement to other fields, where we defined it as the collective experience. And so what is an experience? So an experience is something that stands out in the consumer's mind, that has a certain prominence. It's not just something that's so routine that I don't notice. It's something I actually notice. And usually the way a brand does that is it contributes to a personal goal. So if there's something I'm relying on this brand to do for me, it's going to stand out in my mind. And my thoughts and beliefs and feelings about how that brand is helping me achieve something that I care about is really my engagement. So we were looking at media products. And so if a media product stands out in my mind because it gives me things to talk about with my friends, then that's a way of being engaged with that media product. I watch a television show and I talk about it at the water cooler. That's reflecting my engagement with that product. This was a framework that we proposed early on, where engagement is this higher order construct that manifests itself in various motivational experiences. So talking about and sharing my experience with watching a television show is part of my engagement with it. Or perhaps I rely on certain media product for utilitarian information. That's another example of what we call a motivational experience. We were very clear that this engagement, the collective experience, is what leads to my behaviors. If I am engaged with a television show, I will watch it. If I am engaged with a magazine, I will read it. So it is my engagement that determines my behavior, my use, as well as many other things. It will determine my attitudes towards that. It would also affect my reactions to the advertising in that media. On the other side, we have many scholars who focused on engagement as behaviors. So perhaps the most famous of the articles was one by Jenny Van Dorn, and they define a customer engagement behavior as some behavioral manifestation to a brand beyond purchase. And so really what they had in mind there was if I like a brand, if I share it, if I write a comment, these are not really purchase-oriented actions, but they're indications of my engagement with it afterwards. So engagement is something I do with my hands. I click on things. I type comments, and that's what engagement is. Many other prominent scholars have also adopted this more behavioral definition of engagement. The main problem that I have with these behavioral definitions of engagement is that they ignore one of the most powerful tools that marketers have used for decades to change behaviors, namely the power of messages. Perhaps this is where my background doing marketing communication comes in. So images and words can have a profound effect on the way people think about a brand, and once you've changed my attitude towards the brand, then my behaviors will follow. My view is that you have to integrate what people are thinking about the brand with behavioral engagement. The two need to be connected. Otherwise, you're missing an opportunity. What happened next was a landmark paper by Rod Brody, Linda Hollebeek, and others, and this definition has been cited dozens and thousands of times by now. So what Rod and Linda did, put in one paragraph their definition. Now, the way they defined it was very much in line with the way that Calder and I were thinking about it, and others, with one big difference. So that's, in my view, the big difference was explicitly putting behavior with engagement. So while Calder and I were thinking of a behavior as a consequence of engagement, they were putting it as a central role within their definition of engagement. The concern that I had with this initially is that it was very broad. A problem that I often have when I talk with people about engagement is they use the word engagement to mean so many different things that it almost means nothing. Where within the same sentence, a person can say engagement and mean what people are thinking, and then in the later part of the sentence, they change to mean what people are doing. So I got very frustrated with this, and that's what led to the engagement ecosystem paper. It's kind of like I realized that I was going to lose the battle of defining engagement as strictly a psychological thing. And therefore, what we ended up doing with the ecosystem paper was trying to identify all the different ways that engagement gets used with one big catch. And the catch is we're not going to use the word engagement to refer to all the individual things anymore. Instead, we're going to refer to them by much more specific names. The brand experience is really the psychological part, and we're going to call it the experience rather than its engagement. Brand dialogue behaviors would be the customer engagement behaviors that Van Dorn and others refer to, but rather than calling them engagement, let's call them, by a more specific term, which is a dialogue behavior about the brand. Likewise with shopping and brand consumption. So all of these things interact. So Brody talks about a dynamic iterative process. Well, this starts to describe how my thoughts might affect what I write, which might affect with what I do with the brand, and all of this interacts to make me a more loyal customer towards the brand. This framework has really served as the organizing framework for the Spiegel Research Center that I direct. We've done many studies over the past decade that try to understand the different arrows. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to take us through this diagram and highlight some of the research that we've done. Let's start with the brand action box. Brand actions include all touch points that the brand creates to engage consumers with the brand. As John Dayton points out, what's really important about creating these touch points to stimulate engagement is that you need a strategy. In the Dove case, he gives I think a very good quote that if you're not crystal clear about what the brand's mission is, you can't control what happens when people amplify it. Meaning when the contact hits the pinball machine and starts getting diverted in all sorts of directions. You need a clear sense of what the brand mission is. So that starts with what do you want people to think about the brand, which is why you can't separate the psychology of the brand from the behaviors when you do engagement. Once you have a clear sense of what your mission and what your brand stands for, then you create all sorts of touch points, which could include advertising touch points, but could be social media posts. They could even be related to other Ps. That's what I mean by brand actions. The next part of this framework are other actors. Other actors include all stakeholders who discuss the brand in some way. So this could be prominent media figures like, say, John Oliver, or news hosts, any sort of earned media, but it could also include other consumers. Another example of other actors who influence brand decisions are people who write customer reviews. At Spiegel, we've done a lot of work on customer reviews. So we have about 7 or 8 papers right now looking at different types of customer reviews. I'm going to briefly describe one of those papers. This was a paper that looked at customer reviews for a retailer. And this graph summarizes the main findings from this. And so the question we were looking at was about, when do customer reviews influence a purchase decision? So when does this review from another actor impact the way a focal consumer decides whether or not to make a purchase? And so what we found was the only time I've ever published a 4-way interaction in my life is that the influence of a customer review really depends on some other factors. And so what you'll see is in this bottom graph, we see a very steep slope for the effect of the star rating that other actors have given this under the following circumstances. So number one, there has to be sufficient other reviews out there, but that's not enough. It also has to be one of the higher priced products in the category. It has to be a high involvement purchase. If I'm just buying on price, then the reviews don't have as much effect on me as if I'm buying one of the more premium products within a category. And then also it depends on whether or not I click on the reviews to look at them. So often people get exposed to reviews in a peripheral way. So anytime I look at a product on Amazon, I get to see the volume and the valence. But I also can click on that to actually read reviews and look at a histogram and so forth. So when I click on a review, that's really reflecting what we call decision uncertainty. So I'm not really sure about this product, therefore I'm going to read the reviews. What we found in this paper is that purchase decisions get affected by customer reviews if I'm uncertain, if it's a high involvement product category, and there's enough reviews out there that there's a certain amount of credibility with that. We've done a lot of other work on studying what aspects of a customer review affect your purchase decisions, as well as social influence biases with customer reviews. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the customer brand experience. The field of experience has gotten to be as large as the field of engagement. There are roughly as many big papers on customer experiences as there are engagement. There's not a lot of agreement on what subsumes what. And so a lot of these papers talk about experience as subsuming engagement. Many of the engagement papers talk about experience as being part of engagement. So there's not a lot of agreement on that. So I'm going to stay away from that and just focus on the way that I've been using the term experience, which is about how the customer thinks and feels the brand is helping them in his or her life. We've done a lot of studies over the years. So we started with media. I have a whole book on trying to understand the thoughts and feelings the consumers have with media. So I've already mentioned social, utilitarian. Another experience that people have with media is transportive, where I'm taken to a different place. That really hits on what Higgins was talking about with being absorbed. We've studied that thoroughly for media. I also wrote an article with Linda Hollebeek on trying to understand the experiences that people have with music and how that affects their future purchase behaviors. Another aspect of engagement, another way I can engage with the brand, is through my shopping behaviors. There are many ways to engage with a brand while you're shopping. We can also talk about brand consumption. Brand consumption is when I'm using the brand for the intended purpose. So there are many examples of brand consumption. When I watch a program on Netflix, I would say I'm consuming the brand because I'm doing what I'm supposed to do with Netflix. And if I go to a Harry Potter theme park, I'm consuming the brand. Another example of brand consumption as a form of engagement is content marketing. Content marketing is where a brand creates often journalistic content, but it could be something like a mobile app also that provides value to a consumer. So this is not advertising. So advertising is about creating a persuasive message that I broadcast out to consumers. Content marketing is about creating something that consumers want to consume. We studied this with a leading consulting firm that spends over $200 million a year on creating a variety of content marketing, such as white papers, podcasts, webinars. You could think of in-person conferences where I bring in speakers and my clients come to that as another form of content marketing. So again, consumers are making the decision to consume this because it's going to help them in some ways. This large consulting firm was spending a lot of money on this without knowing whether it was effective. We were able to use big data to understand who was reading white papers, who was downloading the podcasts, and use econometric models to study how the consumption of this content marketing was related to future purchases. I'm not going to go into the details here because I'm short on time. The upshot is we showed that the more content marketing that a consumer chooses to consume, the more leads in the future, the greater the sales in the future. But not all types of content worked. So there's a little bit more of a nuanced story behind it. But again, the point with this is we're creating value through this contact point. So perhaps this podcast helps a business leader stay up on trends that they need to stay up on. And so that would be the experience part of this. What we can measure is the behavioral aspect of it, and then we can link that to subsequent purchase behaviors. The brand action of creating content that consumers want to read, and then the consumer reading it, which is a form of consuming the brand of this consulting firm, leads to subsequent purchases. The next type of engagement is what we call brand dialogue behaviors. By this, we basically mean what Van Dorn meant when they coined the term customer engagement behavior, or CEB. So these are non-purchase-oriented behaviors about the brand. This slide gives many examples of user-generated content. Instead of talking about these, I'd rather talk about one of the studies we did at Spiegel. This study does a really good job of prescribing how to create a brand action to stimulate brand dialogue behaviors that will in turn drive purchase and loyalty and all sorts of good outcomes. I'd like to start with an example that inspired this research project. So KitKat had a promotion on Facebook that basically said, give us your email address and you might win an NFL beverage pail. So this is an example of a brand action designed to stimulate a brand dialogue behavior. So posting something on Facebook that would in turn drive purchase. Here's another example of a contest that KitKat ran. They posted what was called the Fan of the Month Club. The idea was you post a picture of yourself eating a Kit Kat and you could become the fan of the month. Here we have an example of Robin, who has clearly just climbed a mountain, and she's taking in the view and there's a Kit Kat proudly displayed on her lap. Question is, which of these two prompts that KitKat created will do a better job at creating brand loyalty? Our hypothesis coming into this was that the second one is going to be much better, because what's happening in this prompt is that Robin is being asked to elaborate on how KitKat creates value for her. How does KitKat contribute to a goal in her life? So Robin clearly likes to hike, she likes to climb a mountain, and she likes to get back down again. So KitKat is facilitating that goal. The key hypothesis here is that if you create a brand prompt that is forcing elaboration on the customer's relationship with the brand, the prompt will have better long-term effects, meaning purchase, brand loyalty, and so forth. We were able to test this hypothesis with a unique big data set from the Canadian Air Miles reward program. This is a loyalty program in Canada. The idea is you collect miles at many different vendors, so I can get miles for buying gas, for buying groceries, for paying my cell phone bill, and then I can redeem those miles for many different things. I can get air tickets, I can get toasters, I can get gift cards at supermarkets. So the point is there are many different sponsors that award miles, as well as many places that I can collect my miles. Air Miles created a very unique social media environment a few years ago. What was unique about it was they could track what people were saying. So if I was a member of Air Miles, I would have to log in, and they could observe everything that I was saying and doing in that environment, and then link it back to subsequent purchases. Now, in this case, I mean collecting miles at a sponsor. Whenever I swipe my card at some sponsor, Air Miles gets paid for those miles that they issue. Air Miles created the following prompt that they mailed out to their members. Come to our social media site and tell us what you're going to redeem your miles for. All you have to do is share what you want to redeem them for, and you'll get 10 bonus miles, which is worth approximately $1 Canadian. This prompt generated a wide variety of responses. So Some of them include things like, I quote, toaster, digital camera, lift tickets. One person jokingly said he wanted a new wife, but Air Miles doesn't do that. Some of the responses were very different though. So here's an example of one of them. I haven't seen my mother in several years and I want to get a ticket to visit her on her 80th birthday. I would argue that this response is qualitatively different than those in the first line because the consumer is elaborating on how the Air Miles brand is playing a role in their life. This person is getting value from the Air Miles brand because Air Miles is going to allow her to see her mother. While if I just say toaster, I'm not really elaborating on how Air Miles would help me. Our hypothesis was that the more that a customer elaborates on what they're going to redeem for, the more they will purchase in the future. So we built some econometric models to try to understand how the amount of elaboration would affect future purchases with the Air Miles card. What we found is that the more that people elaborate, the more they would use the card in the future, which meant more revenue for Air Miles. So I think this was a very useful study to prescribe how to create a brand prompt to stimulate brand dialogue behaviors that would increase purchases. The key is to create a prompt that's going to engage the consumer by forcing them to think about how the brand plays a role in his or her life. I'd now like to talk about future research opportunities in customer engagement. Two heuristics that I followed through my career when thinking about what to study next are as follows. So first, look for areas where there are new things happening. And I can't think of a better example of this than the area of marketing technology. So I can say with certainty that there will only be more digital environments in the future. And with those digital environments, there will be better customer data and better algorithms. The second heuristic that I follow is to look for intersections. Look for areas that have been studied in different fields that haven't been connected. And where do those fields intersect? A great example of this is the customer engagement literature. Most marketing scholars don't know that there's a parallel universe out there in the computer science field where computer scientists have been studying engagement for 15 years and often come to some similar conclusions to what we've come up with in the marketing and services literature. They don't know about our work and we don't really know about their work yet. If we're going to be working in marketing technology and using that to engage our customers, then it makes sense to connect the two literatures. There are surely opportunities in doing so. I was the co-editor with Hairung Lee of a special issue of the Journal of Advertising on big data, and I also wrote an article that talked about programmatic TV advertising and data. The way that Hairung and I organized this issue was to take the engagement ecosystem that I've been talking about today and look for where are there new sources of data. So what sources of data are produced in each of the boxes and where are there new things happening. So one area where I think there's a lot of stuff happening is in monitoring customers. So within brand actions, of course, we've had promotions data and contact data for decades. But what's increasingly happening is monitoring the behavior of customers and then responding accordingly. So there's the work of Huda van Noord on web care. I've also worked on some papers in this area where I've shown how you can detect trigger events. This is all about listening to customers and trying to identify events that portend the future relationship with that customer. So are there certain things that the customer does that signal that the relationship is vulnerable or that signal that the relationship is likely to grow in the future? I've also worked on a paper on using process control methods to monitor the customer. So as a quick illustration of this, with the content marketing paper that I discussed earlier, we could picture this consulting firm monitoring the reading of content marketing materials, and then a partner sitting down with a client, as a doctor would, saying, I see that you've reduced your engagement a bit. So there's a problem with the relationship. What I recommend is that you take one of our white papers on oil and gas, 2 webinars on risk management, and call us in the morning. The point with this cartoon is that the organization is monitoring the consumer's behavior as a doctor would monitor the health of a patient and intervene when necessary. I think that's going to be a very important area in the future. I think dialogue behaviors have been explored pretty thoroughly. Of course, we ought to be looking out for new social media environments and new ways that people use these environments to discuss brands. Within the shopping bucket, I think one of the most interesting future developments will be what I call contextual information. I take the term contextual from the recommender system literature, where I highly recommend the work of Bamshad Mobasher on context. Context refers to the current situation that the customer is in. So who is with the customer? What is the customer doing? When is it happening? Where is the customer physically? Why is the customer doing it? And how is the customer interacting with you? So these are all contextual variables. So for example, with mobile location data, I can know exactly where a customer is. There are ways of detecting who is with the consumer, and that may modify the touch. So I believe this is going to be a rich area for improving our touch points by leveraging this contextual information to be more relevant to consumers. Within the usage behaviors box, more and more devices are being connected to the internet. So I was driving yesterday and I saw a bumper sticker that said something to the effect, driving behaviors are being monitored by GPS. It must have been one of these sharing cars. But, the point I'm trying to make with this is, as more devices get connected to the internet, we'll have more and more data on how consumers are using them and what the consumer needs and is getting from the interaction with various products and services. I'd also like to mention a special issue that will be coming out in a matter of weeks that I did with Jisoo Hu on the future of digital advertising. In our editorial that introduces this issue, we describe different aspects of future digital touchpoints. Of course, they're going to be individually addressable, data-driven, interactive, and measurable. What I think is an interesting new development is continuous. Our touchpoints with the consumer will not be isolated exposures to an ad. If we've really achieved the ultimate trust with our consumers, the consumers will let us into their lives and we'll be able to monitor their behaviors. We see examples of this already with devices like Alexa. If a customer really trusts Amazon, where Alexa can monitor all of the conversations that customer has. I'd like to close with just a few warnings and potentially opportunities around AI and algorithms. So AI and algorithms should be creating customer engagement. If the main use of AI is to create robocalls that enter the uncanny valley, where they sound almost too human, or if all you're doing is using AI to stalk your customers with creepy retargeting efforts, you're not using customer engagement. One area of AI that I think is especially promising for marketing is the field of recommender system. So the definition of a recommender system is software and techniques that provide suggestions of items that are to be of use to the user. What I find interesting about this definition is the focus on helping the consumer, probably with a personal goal. So I think of Spotify as being very helpful because it introduces me, a user, to music that I'm interested in. I find a lot of book recommendation systems to be very useful because I find books that I didn't know about before and that I want to read. So if you focus your effort on designing AI systems that are helping the consumer, you're really focusing on engaging them. Engaging them is the way of the future. If you don't, consumers will find a way to shut you out. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.